Jeffersonian Republicans believed in having an enlightened citizenry that was educated and was virtuous and enlightened. So during this era of American history in the early 1800s, you saw more and more public schools created for the education of white males. And during this time, it was somewhat lackluster in all states going to this, especially in the South. But if there was an education, it was typically going to be white males. Around this time, though, you did see more private secondary schools come up around, many of whom had existed for over 100 years by that point. There's a famous school in New Hampshire called Phillips Exeter, which back then was known as Exeter, which was created basically in the 1700s to educate wealthy male youth. Okay, so even though the nobility factor of educating society, in this case white males, um, didn't quite pan out to reality large scale. The majority of institutions were still privately owned that conducted their own forms. Many of them had religious bases, others were secular. So it just kind of depends on what their particular thoughts and beliefs were. However, also around this time, there were a number of women who began to question, why can't we also seek education? You have Judah Sargent Murray, a young woman who published an essay that basically defended the right for women to become educated. And her belief was that women are just as intelligent as men. Why can't we be educated similarly? And that sort of equivalence of opportunity starts to emerge. Now, that's not quite the same feminist message that we hear today. Nowadays, we know that women are just as smart as men. We know that women can be just as capable at so many different things. There are discussions about equal pay for equal jobs, that sort of a thing. And so women are still working to this day to obtain truly equal status in society with men. But back then, there were courageous people who started to really recognize that and question the idea of why women couldn't be educated that way. How could mothers ask their sons to be educated if they were not educated themselves? Mothers should be enlightened themselves too, right? So that was a general belief around this time. And another belief was, wow, we have all these Native Americans in our country, and what do we do with them? Yeah, they can have their own tribal authorities and perhaps their tribal educations, but Thomas Jefferson and those who believed in him saw Native Americans as noble savages. What I mean by that is noble savages were people, in this case Native Americans, who were uncivilized, but they could become civilized. Okay? Let's introduce them to Western education and maybe even introduce them to various different Christian beliefs and perhaps convert some of them. That theory is not unlike many of the old European colonial mindsets. And to an extent, it was pretty successful. But it was this belief that white culture could perhaps uplift Native American society. And religion and education were the ultimate beliefs in doing so. Also around this time, you started to see an increase in the number of people take notice of the scientific method so as to improve medicine. Because around this time in American history, you still had old traditional ways. Such, for example, in 1799, when George Washington died, he's believed to have had a throat irritation that eventually led to an infection that killed him. In reality, it was probably more likely that he was bloodlet. Remember how we talked about that a few chapters ago? and he was bloodlet, and he very possibly bled out. So he may have been killed as a consequence of his physician as opposed to any sort of illness he possibly could have had. Okay? So that is something. And the idea, though, of scientific advancements towards medicine started to gain a little bit of fervor around this period, especially as you would have illness epidemics that would sweep through various different cities. How relevant is that in 2020? We still have epidemics, in this case, a pandemic that affects everybody in the world with the coronavirus causing COVID-19. But back then, 200 years ago, it was believed we've got to start doing something about this. If not preventing it, we've got to start perhaps curing it. But one of the things that was discovered around this time is that a lot of people got sick because they lived in unsanitary conditions. Yeah, it's not a good idea to drop your feces in the street and collect trash and anything else in thereof. You're going to not only have that sort of mess, but then you're also going to attract a whole lot of rodents or anything else that carry disease, and it's just going to run rampant. Okay? So the medical profession starts to gain a little bit of traction during this period with its belief in a scientific method. However, birth rates also remained reasonably consistent in the idea of there being perhaps children who pass away as infants. Infant mortality rates were high in this time. Stuff happening to the mother as she was giving birth. The rise of medicine meant the decline in midwifery. Those women who worked in the profession of helping other women give birth, that sort of declined because medical doctors wanted to oust them out of the industry. They saw them as pseudoscientists who were not believers in the scientific method, and they had a good point, but the only people who could really afford a medical doctor were people who had money. So if you're poor and you don't have access to a doctor and there aren't any midwives around, you're kind of left to your own devices, and oftentimes that leads to unnecessary death at birth. So that was something that also came about at the start of the 1800s. But then it was also believed that this new Enlightenment type era, we can become better educated. Europeans at this time used to pick on Americans for being provincial and simple. The best literary works come from the minds of Europeans, not provincial and silly and simple and stupid Americans. Okay? Shakespeare didn't grow up in the American colonies. He's not an American. Okay. It was believed around this time many Americans could develop a strong American literary sense. We can begin to have great literary works that would rival European works, and therefore help the United States gain a little bit more clout from a cultural perspective. So the United States would embark on this literary, cultural aspiration, if you will. Okay? And around this time, you have Noah Webster, a librarian from Connecticut. He was a lawyer and a schoolmaster. He believed in such sentiments that American boys should be educated. They should learn how to write well. They should, by default, learn how to spell correctly. Okay. Well, how do you spell? How do you know how to spell things? You ever hear a word and you don't know what it means or how it's spelled? What do you do in that instance? Well, in 2020, you go look up on Google and just type in, what is this? To those of us who grew up without the internet, I'm Gen X, thank you very much. I bridged that gap between have not and have when it comes to technology standpoint. You would have a dictionary. Ah, Webster's dictionary. Noah Webster believed in the idea that you should be able to be grammatically correct, but also spell correctly, understand various different words, and he should be able to speak and praise his country. He should be able to write about it knowledgeably, and that would add to this literary fervor that would go on in the United States. And it was around this era that you also saw Americanization of the English language as well. Yes, we speak English as the predominant language in the United States. It's not an official language, but it's the one that's pretty obviously accepted. English is a language, was developed in England. It's the Queen's English. It's their English, okay? They brought it to us and developed it within us, yes, right? We just basically created our own version in a sense that we have our way of spelling certain words, our way of pronouncing certain words, and different regional accents. So if you've ever heard somebody from Britain speak English, we're going to have some tea and crumpets around 4. We're going to watch the telly, put on the BBC. There are around 20 different British accents. Don't even get me started on the Scottish accent. We're going to go down to England today. Okay? There are about 20 different British accents, depending upon the region of the British Isles you're in. Okay? That is their language, though. But you go to other former British colonies like Australia, Canada, New Zealand, for example. They also have different accents. The Australian accent's very different there than the British accent. Canadians, eh? What do you say we go have a Molson and go drink some beer, watch some hockey? We're going to go see who's the netminder in this game, huh? Canadians, right? Okay. There are various different regional aspects to the English language that are developed around this time, and partially out of America's interest in becoming more of a cultural icon, raising its stature in the world from a cultural aspiration standpoint. Also around this time, as you had a great awakening about 5 or 6 decades prior to this era, you would have a second great awakening. You see, in the late 1700s, the idea of Deism was brought up about in Europe, and many influential Americans, including Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, bought into the idea. The idea behind Deism is a recognition that there is a higher being, there is a God, and this God created the world. But after that, it kind of stepped back. So what happens in life is really more of an idea of human consequence as opposed to divine intervention. So in a way, it's somewhat of an agnostic view of the world, the belief in a higher being, just without specific religion or whatnot. The idea of a higher authority is there. But you did see a number of ministers in various different Christian faiths who recognized a decline in religious piety. The fervor of the American Revolution and our fight for our, not just independence, but our Constitution, led to various different conversations about where religion really stands in America. And a number of people, especially as they moved out westward or whatnot, kind of fell off the religious wagon, if you will. So there were also people who were religious, such as ministers or whatnot, who recognized the deist movement and saw it as somewhat of a threat. Religious traditionalists were like, wait a second. Okay, these people believe in God, but they're not practicing really religious truth the way that we see it. They're not following biblical scripture or anything else of the sort. that rational religious doctrine is somewhat of a threat to true religious biblical doctrine. So there were those who were skeptical of religion and those who wanted to bring it back to the forefront because they feared those who were skeptical of religion. So you had a second great awakening. Remember, we talked about Jimmy Swaggart on Sunday morning, give me $1,000, right? We talked about a lot of that. As a kid, would wake up on Sunday morning, turn on the TV, and there'd be Sunday morning, televangelists on TV. Jimmy Swaggart was big in the 80s when I grew up, and I will save you if you just hand me your tongue and just let me speak with you and give me money. Yeah, okay. Right? Okay, that's what I took from it. I don't know if that's what he actually said, but that was my impression, right? Okay. Around this time, you have the Second Great Awakening, where you would have more specifically religiously affiliated ministers in Christian Protestant faiths that would gain favor. The Presbyterian Church would move away from its idea of predestination. Remember, John Calvin believed in the idea of people being born predestined to go to heaven. That eventually became the heart and basis of the Presbyterian faith. During this era, the Presbyterians would move away from that. And they would adopt more of an ideology that one obtains heaven by not just accepting Christ in their lives, but living a faithful and giving life. Okay? You must not just accept Christ in order to go to heaven. You must have acts of faith and acts unto others that serve and benefit others and be thoughtful of others. That's more of a true and modern Christian message that was adopted around this time. And the Presbyterians were on the forefront of that. You also had the rise of the Methodist Church around this time. And then the Baptist Church in particular really swept through the American South. To this day, you go anywhere in the South, the preeminent Christian denomination is Southern Baptist. And then there's everybody else. Okay? Southern Baptist, that was the name of the game. And that gave increase and rise to the idea of more traditional religious beliefs based upon Scripture and Christian mindset. Okay? So embracing the fervent, active piety, give me faith, that sort of a thing, really started to grow. And what was also interesting about this movement, women were often involved very heavily. Women may not have had much of a message elsewhere in the house or in work situations, but they sure had influence in churches. And that's the one place where if women were certainly equal, a women's voice was equally heard in the church.